So the morning started with the defense having to pick up his cross that was interrupted yesterday. He makes Julie repeat that she rarely speaks with Courtney Proctor by phone. And then he goes after these 67 phone calls, and she says, well, that's not a lot. He asked, do you maintain that you never discussed the case and didn't discuss the arraignment? And she won't deny it, but she keeps saying she doesn't remember. She does finally admit she at least mentioned Reed's arrest to Courtney. He was asking about the conversation before the 9 a.m. arraignment, and she says she doesn't remember. He referred to a call at 10:58 a.m. after the arraignment. They had a half an hour conversation. She wasn't babysitting for Courtney at the time. And finally, she admits, well, they could have talked about the arraignment. And the defense asked her, did you tell her you were a witness? And Julie says she doesn't remember. It came out that Julie said that she was nervous to speak to the police. And the defense said, were you nervous the police might ask to speak to your son? And she said no. Of course she's going to say that. The defense asked her about a police interview at 5:30 p.m. on February 10th with the troopers. And Julie says they were interviewed together. Wow. She says it was not a long interview. At 6:17 p.m., she called Proctor's personal cell phone. And she says, oh, well, she doesn't remember that. Well, the defense has records. They have two calls, one for 1 second and another one at 6:21. When Proctor called her back, they talked for 4 minutes, and finally she says she won't deny that she spoke with him. The defense asked her, when did you get Proctor's personal cell phone number? And the answer was years ago. So they'd known this family for years. Julie says she's best friends with Jen McCabe, and Courtney Proctor is close friends with Julie. Karen, however, is not a friend at all. She never saw John and Reed have any kind of fight. She said that on January 28th, she drove Nicole to Waterfall. She's close with Nicole Albert, so that's Brian Albert's wife. She knew Brian Higgins, and she knew he was a friend of Brian Albert's, and it was clear to her that they were friends. She saw Karen Reed as a bubbly person, and that is her usual personality, and she was her usual the night in question. She said that Colin is close to Nicole and Brian. She said she got home at about 11. She and the defense counsel got into this whole thing about her saying that her husband was home at about 12:10 a.m. And the interesting thing about this, and the thing that's going to flag anybody who has any experience with witness testimony, is that this mistake, this inaccuracy is exactly the same as the inaccuracy of the other witness. So she was asked, did you discuss or coordinate your testimony or your answers to what time your husband got home? And she said no. Well, of course she's going to say that. But here's the thing. Witnesses make mistakes. If two witnesses say exactly the same thing, that's actually a red flag. When two witnesses make exactly the same mistake, then that's a problem. She says their home's about a half a mile away, and they went through this whole thing that they did with Chris Albert. How long does it take to walk home and all that? The defense shows her the waterfall video, the same one he used to impeach Chris Albert. She says that when Chris got home, she was in the bedroom. She saw him in the bedroom. She said she heard the door open when he came into the house. His clothes were wet. She said she was sitting up in bed. Remember, Chris said she was laying down in bed? She agreed that Chris was asleep when Colin came home. And the defense says to her, it was an ordinary night, so you wouldn't be really watching the clock, right? Her estimate and his estimate had to have been coordinated. The defense didn't say that, but Then he moves on to how specific Julie was about receiving a call from Jen at 5:55 a.m. So she's able to recall this precisely, but can't recall any of the 67 phone calls with Courtney Proctor. She testified there was nothing unusual at the Fairview home. When she got there, no one was guarding the scene. There were no taillight pieces on the lawn. Nothing was preventing her from walking all over the lawn if she wanted to. He showed her a photo of Fairview, the side door. She said that's where Brian appeared. She was able to see him, and she went into the side door to talk to everybody. They talked about where the door to the basement was. It's just before the kitchen. And she said everybody was in the Albert house at Fairview discussing what happened. The defense asked who decided that Jen McCabe should contact Sergeant Lank. And her answer was, I don't remember who decided. We were all talking, which means A, yes, somebody decided to contact Lank on his personal number, by the way, and that they were all having a discussion about it. Julie sent McCabe Lank's cell phone number, and the defense asked, did you see Jennifer delete that? So questions are not evidence. The prosecution is objecting every time the defense starts making points. Turns out the state police had actually tried repeatedly to get in touch with Julie and interview her, but she was avoiding them. Finally, on April 1st, the state police called Chris. And then on April 3rd, Julie went for an interview. She said she spoke with 2 troopers who did not include Proctor, and they looked through her phone contacts to see if Proctor's name was in there. They didn't seize the phone. They didn't do an extraction, nothing like that. They just looked at the phone and gave it back. She testified that Karen was not drunk. There was no tension and no argument. She claims she knew where Colin was. She says he was at his friend's and then he was at Fairview. And she says that Colin was at Fairview after midnight. But we know that she actually didn't find out about that until later. She says she doesn't recall the interview with Trooper Proctor. On redirect, the prosecution basically tries to minimize everything and mentioned that she had 2 interviews with other troopers. After the morning break, the defense and the defendant were excused from the courtroom, and they had this hearing about an individual charged with witness intimidation. The Commonwealth was asking that a particular reporter be barred from attending inside the courtroom. And this guy's lawyer showed up and said, I had no notice. I had basically 15 minutes notice. And it's not right for his client to be excluded as a reporter. He talked about the process. He talked about First Amendment rights. And in spite of him not having had any notice, the judge heard arguments anyway. She wanted to get it done with. And then when she read her decision, she read it from a prepared piece of paper, as if the decision had already been made. So that was interesting. The decision was that this reporter will not be permitted to be present during testimony of a number of witnesses for the prosecution. The next witness was Nicole Albert. So this is Brian's wife. They live at 34 Fairview. They have the 5 children. On January 28th, and this was weird, she said on January 28th, she planned to take her son out, Brian Jr., it was his birthday, but there was a storm coming, so she canceled it. But then she went and made plans to go to the waterfall with her friends. And the plans with her son were to go out for some apps and maybe a drink. Well, she canceled that and went out for a drink with other people. Okay. She said Brian Higgins was a friend of Brian Albert's. She described who was there, which was consistent with what everybody else said. She said the 2 Brians came in separately. She said she'd only met John once and she had never met Reed. She said she had no interaction with Reed. Reed and O'Keefe had never been to Fairview before. And then there was this. It was interesting. She said after the band wrapped up, she suggested that Jen go to Fairview and say happy birthday to Brian. Just come on over to the house. And this is when this discussion started happening about where people were going to go after, whether it was going to be the pizza place or back to Fairview. Well, in Julie's testimony yesterday, she said she was only at the waterfall for a short time. She had a headache. She left, remember? So Julie was gone by the time this discussion came up. So how on earth was she testifying about it yesterday? According to other people, this conversation occurred after Julie was long gone. So Nicole said that they left around 12. It was just starting to snow a little. It's a 5-minute drive to Fairview. When she got home, Brian Jr. was there with his 2 friends, 2 female friends, and Colin was there, but Colin was just about to leave. She says she usually uses the side door, but that night she went in the front door because she wanted to be in the foyer and be able to kick off her shoes. And she bumped into Colin, and he'd said his ride was coming, so he was going. Well, she'd just come in. Where was the ride? And it's freezing out. Okay. She said that later on in the evening, they did have music on at the house. Brian Higgins came in close to the same time as Matt and Jen. Higgins drove a Jeep, she said. She said he parked at the curb at the mailbox on the road. She said Caitlin was also there and people were drinking there. She said Caitlin was the last to leave. She said that was around 2 a.m. That was when the last people left, and that would have been Caitlin. She says Brian Higgins left around 1:30-ish. Jen and Matt and Brian Jr.'s friends left at about 1:45, and Caitlin left at about 2. She said when everybody left that Brian and her son were upstairs sleeping. She said the 2 Brians earlier, so Brian Higgins and Brian Albert were in the family room, then moved into the kitchen. She said she didn't see or hear anything unusual that was happening outside. She said her son's friend Julie went outside at one point and came back in. She said no one else came in and neither Reed nor O'Keefe came in. She said there were no arguments. She said Caitlin got picked up at 2 a.m. I wonder if we're going to hear about who picked her up and what she saw. Then she said Brian was awake in bed and she went to bed at about 2:30-ish. She said on Saturday the 29th at 6:30 in the morning, Jen woke her up by bursting into her bedroom.
Well, at some point between 6 and 6:30 that morning, my sister Jennifer came bursting into my bedroom.
She said Jen was hysterical. Really? You saw Jen McCabe on that dash cam video. Who was running around acting crazy at the scene? It was Karen Reed. You heard the 911 call. Nobody was hysterical except Karen Reed. Anyway, so apparently now she's hysterical. So Jen told her that something happened to John. He'd been taken to hospital. She told her the police want to talk to you. So she gets up and she throws on a sweatshirt, and as she's walking down the stairs, Officer Lank is walking in. She looked outside and saw maybe 2 cruisers. She said Matt McCabe showed up at around the same time as that, and I was waiting to hear about when Brian Higgins showed up, but she hasn't said anything yet. She said she talked to Lank for 45 minutes. She said the officers left, then they sat at the table and discussed it. Then she says Brian Higgins came over at some point, and she thinks that her husband, Brian Albert, called him. She thinks it was 7:30 or 8. She said Carrie called and gave her updates. She said at about 8:30, Julie arrived with donuts and described the whole thing about Julie going in the house the same as Julie described it, except Nicole says that Julie was there 1 to 2 hours, but she's not sure. And all the people there, she said, stayed for 1 to 2 hours. Nicole was not interviewed until a couple of days later, and that interview took place in her home. She said in the morning, morning, it had started to look like blizzard conditions. They showed her pictures of her house from different angles. And you can see in the picture, if somebody's laying on the ground, you wouldn't necessarily see them. And there was all this coming and going all at the same time from that house, all these people driving, going back and forth in and out. I mean, anybody could have hit them. Anyway, so he just showed her a lot of pictures of the house. And I think the whole purpose was really to give the jury, to be able to get those pictures in and get the jury a really good view. Then they got into the dog. You're telling me that these are dog bites. And when I look at those injuries, yeah, they could be consistent with dog bites. But I don't want to just look on the internet. So down the rabbit hole I went into like forensic journals and everything else. And I'm not a forensic expert, you should know. There are people who specialize in this specific area of forensics. And I read an interesting journal article in which a woman had been convicted of homicide of her son. And the allegation was that she had stabbed him. And she swore up and down she didn't do it. And it turns out she didn't. It was later discovered that these were dog bites, not stab wounds, and she was finally exonerated, but not until after she'd spent some years in jail and lost her children. So getting that proper evaluation is really important, just like expertise in anything else. I mean, having somebody say, yeah, I don't think these are dog bites, or I'm a dog owner and I think they're dog bites. I mean, that's not enough, right? And there are forensics experts who do this. There's a difference between identifying whether something is a dog bite, yes or no, and actually identifying the dog. They have to measure the injuries. They measure the dog's mouth. There's a whole big thing to it. It gets really complex. It's not a matter of you can just look at something and say, oh, yep, this is what it is. It sounds like this wasn't done in this case. There can be other explanations for those injuries, and we'll have to see. This dog that the Alberts had was a German Shepherd mix, and it was not police trained. So this is not a police canine. They'd had this dog for 6 years. They got it from a shelter in Texas. It's a rescue. So who knows what that dog had been through before they got it. So Nicole testified that when they got home that night, that Brian got the dog from the bedroom, brought her down, and let her out back to do her business. Well, the backyard is completely fenced in. And she said that Brian stayed at the door and Chloe was only out there for a couple of minutes, and Brian brought her back up to the bedroom, and that was that. So Chloe wasn't running around out in the neighborhood or anything. The other thing I noted when she was talking about the dog is she referred to the dog as it. A couple of times she referred to the dog as her, but more often she referred to the dog as it. As a dog owner, that really stood out to me. They talked about her and Brian moving away from Fairview. They moved in April 2023, and she says they'd always planned to go. They planned to downsize, and that the move had nothing to do with what happened. On cross-examination, Miss Little, for the defense, brought out that Julie was at the bar for about 4.5 hours. She saw no tension between O'Keefe and Reed. She did see the two Bryans play fighting, and it was important to her to say they were fooling around. She didn't like the term play fighting. And then Little asked her about her husband, Brian Albert, being a highly trained fighter. And Nicole seemed to almost take exception to it. And she said, no, that's not true. And Little says, but, well, he has boxing experience. Well, yes, that's true. And he has fighting experience through the Marines and through the police department. Well, yeah, that's true too. And then they go back to this whole thing at the waterfall. So they left the waterfall shortly after 12 or around 12. They showed video of people leaving and caught a video of Nicole leaving Waterfall with a drink in her hand. She said Brian Albert's work car was a black Ford Edge. And the defense was asking, well, you heard that this Ford Edge was talked about in relation to this case, that it was important, and you didn't mention it. Well, the prosecution was objecting. Nicole said she wasn't sure where Higgins was parked, but then she gave a detailed description of where he parked. And then she was describing how he pulled in and then he backed out and then he parked. When she described seeing Colin there, the way she described it was, she said to him, "What are you doing here?" She obviously didn't expect him. There was no vehicle out there waiting for Colin. When Colin's saying, "Oh, my ride's coming, I have to leave," Nicole said she never saw Colin leave. They went back to the dog. And Nicole agreed, yeah, it's a large dog. It's 70 pounds. And the defense tried to make it sound like she doesn't like strangers. And Nicole said, no, that's not true. She's fine with strangers. She doesn't like other dogs. And then the defense brought out, well, there's a well-documented bite history with this dog. And Nicole's saying, that's other dogs. And Little brings up, well, in May of 2022, there was an incident where 2 women were bit. And the witness explained, well, because Chloe was fighting with another dog and the 2 women were trying to break up the dog fight, they got in the middle of it. And it came out that in that incident, Chloe had escaped from the backyard and that Chloe has escaped before. 4 months later, the dog was rehomed. The dog is now in Vermont, and the witness said that she gave information about the dog's whereabouts to whom the dog was given. Well, it sounds like it was not given to the defense. She said they never heard a crash. They never heard yelling, no screeching brakes. So they're not hearing sounds that would be consistent with an accident after they got home. Then the defense said that on July 23rd, that Nicole testified in front of a grand jury and she wasn't able to place the 2 Bryans at the table, that the 2 Bryans had left the room. But the prosecution was objecting before she could finish the question. The defense eventually effectively pointed out that there was a period of time when both Bryans' whereabouts were unknown. She said the distance to the basement is only 4 to 5 steps. Then the defense confronted her. She said, you told Sergeant Lank a different story about when people were leaving. And the witness is saying, I'm not sure. I don't think so. And so the defense wanted to refresh her memory and show her a statement, a report. And then the prosecution wanted a sidebar. According to the report, Lank's report, Nicole told Lank that her daughter left at 12:15. Nicole said, no, that's not what she said. So she was clear. She was adamant that she never said that he must have been confused. And in trying to sort of explain how Lank maybe was confused, she said, well, everybody was talking at the same time. So Lank was sitting there getting the witness statement, all of them at once, all around the table, all at the same time. Wow! Whether it was Lank's mistake or not, it contains a very important inaccuracy, and that's about timeline and where people were. She admitted that the whole group at the house, they were all sitting around the table discussing everything at length before they were interviewed. On February 3rd, Proctor interviewed her, so this would have been 6 days later, and the defense said, you left a lot of names out in respect to who was at the house. And she said, no, she told Proctor who was there. And so the defense ran through the names. And she's saying, yeah, I believe I did. So again, it looks like another report, so this time Proctor's, is inaccurate. So either the witness is lying or the report wasn't done properly, one or the other. And really, with Nicole's demeanor, her choice of words, her emphasis, her cadence, all of that, I think she's telling the truth here. I think she did tell Proctor what she says she told him. So there's something wrong with the report. Yet again, she did say she might not have mentioned that Colin was there. And she said the reason for that is because Colin had left. So in her brain, he's not part of everything, that he'd left as soon as they got home. She insisted the first thing that she remembers about the morning of the 29th is her sister, Jen McCabe, bursting into her bedroom. And they show a photo of the house again and say, well, where's your bedroom? So she points to her bedroom, and the bedroom is the top left 2 windows of the house, the front of the house. And the defense confronted her. Well, you didn't hear sirens? Well, no, she didn't hear sirens. But in all fairness, previous testimony from first responders was that they didn't need sirens because there was a snowstorm, nobody was on the roads, no need to wake up the whole world, so they just needed their lights. The defense wanted to know, well, how were you not awakened by these lights? And she said, well, I had the blinds closed and the curtains closed. There is the matter of Karen Reid's screaming, mind you. So she thinks Jen McCabe was there at 6:30 and the surveillance shows 6:45, so that's pretty close. Then the defense brings up 2 phone calls that were answered at 6:07 and 6:08 to Nicole from Jen McCabe. Well, the prosecution starts objecting. The defense is able to show the witness this Celebrate report, and the prosecution wants another sidebar. So they did that. And the witness maintained she did not answer any phone calls at 6:07 and 6:08. And the defense goes after it. Well, this one, somebody answered this call. It shows it was answered, and it was a 9-second call. And then the next one is a 7-second call. And the defense said it was just you and your husband. You were the only 2 people in that room who could have answered that call, correct? And the prosecution objected. And then the judge interrupted. It's time for lunch. And I find this interesting. I'm noticing a pattern, and maybe I'm wrong. And maybe you can tell me. It appears that the cross-examination by the defense is regularly interrupted by, it's morning break. Whoops, it's lunchtime. I think we're going to break for the day. Whereas the prosecution's direct is not interrupted. And I haven't gone back and counted. I don't have time. In the afternoon, they continued the cross of Nicole Albert. They came back from lunch and went to sidebar. Little was asking, you have blankets in your house, your husband is a first responder, and was trying to sort of get out the fact that, hey, you didn't go out, you didn't do anything, you could have helped, you didn't help. That's what she was going for, except I think she ended up scoring one for the prosecution by accident, because here's what happened. The witness said, we didn't go outside because we had no idea what was going on. On redirect, the prosecution brought out the fact that Nicole doesn't know how to interpret a Celebrate report. And they talked again about the dog. And she again referred to Chloe, the dog, as it. But then when they were talking about the process of rehoming the dog, she did get emotional at the idea of the dog being put down. She said she'd called shelters and they told her the dog would be too hard to adopt out if it had a bite history, and they would probably just put it down. And Nicole said, I couldn't let that happen. There was some emotion at that idea. She said that the dog was in the room when Jen came in, when Jen burst in, right? She said she did not receive any voicemails from Jen McCabe. So somebody answered that phone. And then she said to the defense, she did provide information regarding the dog's whereabouts to the Commonwealth. She was insistent about this, and the prosecution stopped, asked to approach. This is a big deal. If Nicole Albert gave that information and made that information available to the prosecution and they didn't disclose it to the defense, this is a big, huge deal. This is a big, huge problem. The prosecution asked to approach at this point, and that was it for this witness. Next up was Brian Albert. He's a retired Boston police officer. And the prosecution was asking, so, January 27th, 28th, where were you during the day? And he answered he was in New York City at a police funeral. And this has come up before. And, I wonder why that's relevant. Why are they doing that? I have some ideas as to why they're doing that, but let's hear from you. Why do you suppose they're doing that? I think they have a very specific purpose. He said Kevin Albert was also there with him in New York. Also Brian Higgins. He and Brian Higgins are friends. They drove back because the storm was coming. They went and picked up Brian Albert's, all these Brian Albert's Ford Edge, which is a work vehicle. Okay. He met Higgins at the bar called the Hillside. He testified they went for food. Okay. At approximately 9 to 9:30. And then he said they had a drink. So then it comes out, but he actually didn't have food. I guess Higgins did, but he didn't. Then they drove to the waterfall. He said there was no snow yet. He said he parked to the left of the door at the waterfall. He said Higgins stayed at the Hillside at first and came to the waterfall after. He says he's known Jen McCabe since she was 7 years old. He described the whole scene at the bar and who was there and what was going on pretty much the same as everybody else. Same with, there were no arguments, everything was fun. It was all pretty much the same. There was nothing that stood out as contradictory, let's put it that way. He referred to Karen as the defendant, even in his narrative. And this is actually not that unusual for a police officer to do that, especially an officer with that many years experience. It would just fly out of your mouth. It would be pretty natural. But that civilian, Chris Albert, is a different story. And Chris Albert was doing that too. So, when you think about language and where people get it, how they use it, and when they use it, and what they normally use and don't, this is interesting. Brian says that John O'Keefe was a friend of Julie and Chris. Oh, really? I mean, you heard. Nevercracker, and they're sending him pictures on his lawn. And he said he met Reed a week prior at the Hillside when she was there with O'Keefe, and nothing stood out to him. So basically, there are no problems, right? He said on that night, January 28th, he had no interaction with Reed. He said the atmosphere was fun. He said it was winding down a little before 12. He left first with Nicole, Caitlin, and Higgins. There was talk of going to Chris's sub shop, or that people could come by. And again, he's describing this at the end of the night. And I'll point out again that Julie Albert could not have heard this conversation because she left already ages ago. They show video of them leaving. It's 11:58 according to the timestamp. He said his wife and daughter were in the vehicle with him. And is this his work vehicle now? I mean, they didn't really say. Then he said when they got to Fairview, Brian Higgins was backing out of Fairview so that Brian Albert could pull in. So Brian Higgins beat them to Fairview. Okay? He's there first. According to Brian Albert, Higgins was driving a Jeep, and he says, oh, well, I think it's a white Jeep. And then he says he had a plow on his truck. Wait a minute. Is it a Jeep or a truck? He says he had a plow on his truck and skimmed snow off of the driveway for us, and then backed out and then parked. Well, that's interesting. Brian Albert testified they didn't really use the garage for vehicles. And he said once Higgins pulled out of his driveway so that he could pull in, he didn't really pay attention to where Higgins parked. He said the people present were Brian Jr., two of his female friends, and his nephew, Colin Albert. He says Colin was standing in the kitchen with Brian Jr., and now this contradicts what Nicole said. She said she bumped into him in the hall. And this is after, she'd been cleaning up and all this. So she'd been in the kitchen and she doesn't describe him as being there, but now Brian Albert is saying that Colin was in the kitchen with Brian Jr. He does say that Colin left, that Colin said he was getting picked up, and that Colin had left within 5 minutes of them coming home. He says nobody else arrived, and that was interesting because the statement there was premature because Jen and Matt arrived after that. So the prosecution was able to correct this, right? And he says, oh yeah, Jen and Matt came. And he thinks that Colin left before the McCabe's arrived. They brought up Chloe, and oh man, immediately you could see and hear the emotion in him. This was not put on in any sense. In fact, you could see he was trying not to show emotion. He referred to Chloe the whole way as her. That's important to me. So he let her out to do her business. He says there's a gate in the backyard, that there are train tracks behind the house and the trains go by a lot. He said he stayed at the door while Chloe did her business and that she was only out there for 2 to 3 minutes. He took her upstairs. The prosecution was asking about the train tracks behind the house, and he said, well, yeah, it's loud, but I'm used to it now. They were listening to music inside the house. The mood was still good. He says he was there the whole night except for a period of time when he and Brian Higgins went to his son's room upstairs to look at photos. And he said they were only there for 2 or 3 minutes. He said Brian left at around 1:30 and others left after that. He said once Brian Higgins left, Brian Albert went up to his room to watch TV. Julie's brother came there, and I think she means a friend of Brian Jr.'s, and that she went out to talk to him and then came back in. So at some point, somebody else had come to the house and didn't see John O'Keefe out front, and she'd gone out and didn't see him either. The prosecution was able to make it clear that where the kitchen was, where everybody was situated, was at the back of the house, and they wouldn't have necessarily heard or seen anything. Brian Albert said that neither O'Keefe nor Reed ever came into the house. He said around 2 a.m. his wife came to bed, and then he said that Jen burst into the room at around 6:30. Interesting how both witnesses use the same word to describe this. Burst into the room. Now they've been married a really long time. Maybe it's coincidence. But again, he says that Jen was almost hysterical. And then he says she said John is dead. And then testimony stopped. And here's the thing. If she'd said that, that would be weird because she'd been, according to everybody else, saying he was in the hospital, not that he was dead. So that's interesting, but I don't think that's going to get considered. I have a question. If Jen was going into the house and bursting into the bedroom in hysterics, waking them up, why didn't she do that immediately? Why didn't she run in and say, come out and help us? I don't understand that. I understand, you get there and maybe you're going to try and do CPR or you're going to phone 911. I mean, you have to start those things first. So I get that wouldn't be the first thing you would do. You need to get medical help on the way. But why not immediately after that run into the house and burst into the bedroom if that's what she's going to do? She doesn't burst into the bedroom until the police want to talk to them. So it's a little weird. Brian Albert says he went downstairs to talk to the police. He said when he got down the stairs, he was asked, who did you see when he got down the stairs? And his answer was a Canton police officer. Well, it was Lank, and he knew him. He doesn't say Lank. He's met Lank multiple times, and he knew him, and he knew that Lank was friends with Chris Albert. And he confirmed that the police spoke to all of them all together. And when he was asked how long that conversation with the police went on, he said 10, 15, 20 minutes. He doesn't really know. So Lank left and then returned with a Lieutenant Gallagher. We heard from him earlier in the trial, and Brian Albert knew who Gallagher was. And then it was pointed out, well, the police were invited there via phone call. Well, yeah, that's because there was that whole exchange about maybe we should call Lank and get him over here, get him back here. Anybody got his personal cell phone number? And then now the suggestion is that maybe Jen McCabe deleted that number after Julie Albert gave it to her. So it's presented as the police were invited there. And that second conversation took about a half an hour. He said he called Brian Higgins to let him know. He said he's not aware of the relationship between Karen Reed and John O'Keefe and Higgins. He spoke with Proctor and another trooper. He said he'd never met Proctor before, but he did know the other one. He had met the other one just through work, though. He said he spoke with troopers at Jen's house that Saturday before noon. Oh, well, that's interesting. He said he went to Jen's because she was distraught. And then it came out, well, he also knew that there were troopers gonna be there. So he did say that at that time that troopers spoke with Brian separately. They showed him photos of the house, exact same photos as they showed to Nicole. The one addition to testimony here was that after that day, it rained and the snow was melting and some of it was shoveled out. So the photos do look a bit different from what they looked like on that morning of the 29th. They talked about the house and selling the house, and his testimony was pretty much the same as his wife's. And he said his brother, Chris Albert, put him in touch with his realtor. And before a cross, judge requested a sidebar, and then they broke for the day. That's all I've got for you for now. Trust your gut. I'll see you in the comments.